All right, week 2 in Habakkuk. Here we go. Um, this session is probably the shortest of the sessions. I didn't realize that until kind of wrapping it up. Um, so I'll give you a little more that maybe you could go and explore if you have more time. Depends on your class and how you operate. Just a reminder: the goal is not to have the curriculum, as a script for you to teach from. It's basically a summary and a resource of different things that you can talk about, and really the things that we want to make sure we're emphasizing is discussion and sharing, and the practice. We want to always land on the same practice. So you could always start your session talking about last week's practice as well. Last week was prayer, so you could. Whoops, sorry, I'm taking you for a ride there. But the last week's practice was on prayer, so you could discuss how that practice went for this week to begin your time as well. Just a good reminder there. So here we are. Each session I try to catch us up to where we're at in Habakkuk. And here we have seen that Habakkuk has filed his complaint with God. And now we're going to read of God's reply to that complaint, to that lament. And what we see is that God's not going to ignore the injustice in Judah. But his solution creates a whole new set of problems. To judge the people of Judah, he's going to raise up the Chaldeans, the Chassidim, I think is what they're called in Hebrew. But really, this is a reference to the Babylonians. Just as the Assyrian Empire had been used as an instrument of God's wrath, so will the Babylonian Empire. And again, this creates a whole new set of problems. I didn't include the whole passage in here, but I thought, you look at this first verse, look at the nations and observe, be utterly astounded, for I'm doing something in your days that you will not believe when you hear about it. So this is God's reply to Habakkuk. And interestingly enough, I've heard this passage quoted kind of as a rallying cry of like, look, God's about to do something great. Like, you're not even going to believe what God has to do. I've heard that verse in this context, but if you think about it in its original context of what's going on, God's about to tell Habakkuk about how he's going to use Babylon to judge. And the unbelievable thing is that he'll use Babylon to bring judgment on Judah. So it's not like as K-Love encouraging as we might think. And that's just an opportunity to discuss why context is important to understanding the scripture in this verse. That's a good kind of Bible reading tactic that we can talk about. But secondly, share a time when you realized that God was working for your good and his glory, even when you could not see or believe it at the time. This is a profound thing that we're seeing here. Habakkuk, God is telling Habakkuk, yeah, I'm going to work for your good and for my own glory. That's what God's saying to him. But it's hard to believe. And it's hard to really see and understand how this is going to be good and for God's glory. So there's times in our lives like that all the time when it's like, God, it doesn't make sense that you would disappoint me here. Or, God, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why you wouldn't allow me to receive this blessing, or you wouldn't heal here, or you wouldn't give the promotion, or you wouldn't, rescue me from trouble. So share a time when that's been real for you. And I think those can be good opportunities in our group time. So then here's what God says Habakkuk has to look forward to. Look, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans. And again, this is another way to talk about Babylon. The Babylonians were actually Neo-Chaldeans, meaning they're a group of people that formed out of the Chaldeans. I tried to put some stuff in there in the curriculum that gave some background. But if you have time, another thing that you can do is trace the origin of Babylon in the Bible. Do you know the first place where Babylon is talked about? Do Genesis 10 and 11 talks about the origins of Babylon. We typically call it the Tower of Babel, but it's the same Hebrew word for Babylon. So in Genesis 10 through 11, what you're really seeing the author of Genesis do is give an account for the origin story of Babylon. So what you could do in your group is take time to just read that story and say, what does this tell us about Babylon? What is the writer of Genesis trying to tell us about what's at the core of Babylon's identity? And I think you can see some things start to emerge that will make sense then of what we read in Habakkuk, right? They're set on making a name for themselves. They're building this ziggurat, this big kind of temple tower. Maybe it's even a watchtower, which has military connotations. They're building the city and this tower to make a name for themselves and kind of usher the gods down for their own purposes. They're disobeying the mandate to go and to be a blessing and to fill the earth. Instead, they're trying to occupy one space under, empire, basically. And God condemns this, says this is not good. And then he lovingly scatters them. But Babylon there is this picture of kind of an archetypal empire, of a paradigm of imperialism. And that's what you see throughout Habakkuk. That's what Babylon is all about. So that's one thing that you could do to just kind of add another layer of understanding Babylon in the biblical story. But you could also just slow down, have people maybe in groups read this section, and just start listing a characterization of Babylon. That's what I had listed in the curriculum for you. So once you kind of read all about Babylon, they're wicked. They have this massive army. They're devouring land. They're enacting violence. They're set on all of these things. They're gathering prisoners like sand. I mean, it's not good. They're prideful and whatnot. The question becomes, how could God use wicked Babylon? And that's a real pressure point. Like, how could God use such a wicked nation? And this is where I think it's really beneficial for us to understand the biblical story. And, you have the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, where God has delivered Israel from Egypt, brought them to Sinai to form as his people, gave them instruction, the tabernacle so he could be with them. They've journeyed in the wilderness to go to the promised land. They disobeyed, and so a new generation kind of had to form. And then when you get to Deuteronomy, you have this new generation that kind of has to receive the covenant stipulations again. And so Moses gathers them on the wilderness of Moab to kind of re-deliver the covenant instructions and to re-up the covenant with this new generation. And when you come to the end of Deuteronomy, there's this choice that Moses presents before them. He says, you could follow the Lord and there'll be blessing and goodness. Or you could disobey and there will be curses. So there's some stuff in the curriculum about blessing and curses that you could look at. But when you look at some of the consequences of the curses, it starts to make sense of how God could send a wicked nation like Babylon. Because, this is what it says in Deuteronomy 28. Because you didn't serve the Lord your God with joy and a cheerful heart, even though you had an abundance of everything, you will serve your enemies that the Lord will send against you. So the Lord will send enemies against you in famine, thirst, nakedness, and a lack of everything. He will place an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. This is harsh, but this is the curses, the consequences of not following Yahweh. The Lord will bring a nation from far away, from the ends of the earth, to swoop down on you like an eagle. A nation whose language you won't understand. Really, hearkening back to Babel, right? The Tower of Babel. A ruthless nation, showing no respect for the old, not sparing the young. So what we see in Habakkuk is the fulfillment of the curses predicted in Deuteronomy. So that's how God could use wicked Babylon. It helps us to understand a little bit about why God is doing this. But there's something so important to see here, that these blessings and curses of the law are talked about in the New Testament in relation to Christ. Paul, seeing that Israel suffered the curses of their covenant unfaithfulness, sees Christ as the faithful one who rescues and redeems us, Israel and us, as from those covenant curses. That's what he says in Galatians 3. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. He's not saying the law is a curse, but part of not following the law had brought a curse. And so what did Christ do? He became a curse for us. He became the one afflicted. Because it is written, cursed is everyone who hung on a tree. Through his death on the cross, he became a curse. And why did he do that? The purpose was that the blessing, compared to the curse, it's so that the blessing of Abraham, this is back in Genesis 12, would come to Gentiles. This is, in other words, non-Jews, those who didn't receive even the opportunity to receive the blessing of Yahweh by Christ Jesus, so that we could receive the promised Spirit through faith. There's a lot we could talk about with that as well. But here's the point. Israel disobeyed. They didn't enact injustice. They didn't follow after Yahweh. And they received the curses of that, the consequences of Babylon coming. Christ comes and he redeems us from the curse by becoming that curse, so that we could receive the blessing of Abraham. Jew and non-Jew alike. So there's something beautiful about the gospel here that we can emphasize in our community groups as well. Another place you could really lean in is reading much of Galatians. So another exercise, you could compare this to Romans 1, 8 through 25. You can see some maybe common themes. And then God's answer to Habakkuk's prayer was pretty unexpected. I would say that's true. Share a time when your prayers were answered in a way that was unexpected. And then focus on the practice for this week as well. Okay, so that's session 2. Hopefully, this was helpful again for you. We'll see you next week.